to
mute on.
Broaden the knowledge base around personal finance for different segments of the population. The Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, when it was formed after the Dodd-Frank Act was passed, had a whole initiative or department, so to speak, that was focused on financial education. And I think the educational community as well really recognized that there was a role for personal finance education in schools. Historically, the idea had been that you learn about personal finance by doing, or you learn from the family, and there was no real systematic instruction around personal finance at any grade level in either K-12 or college arenas. And the Department of Education in various states began to really focus on the need for introducing courses on personal finance into their curricula, and some states now mandate that. And so really the momentum began to build from that as a silver lining, so to speak, from the financial crisis, and it's continued to build, so that there are several policy initiatives underway to improve the financial literacy, again, as all segments of the population. And in the educational arena, the sandbox that we play in, so to speak, there is significant momentum towards helping our young people become financially informed before they graduate from high school onto college or the workplace. There's still a lot of work to be done, but I think there's been significant progress.
And we're going to talk about some of the specific improvements in terms of different states adopting requirements and things like that. Let me start on the other side. What do you see on a broad level as what are some of the larger obstacles, almost systematically, I guess? You know, obviously, as individuals, we face obstacles too, but what do you see as some of the systematic obstacles that both historically and now have gotten in the way of? Because, you know, I think you talk to most people, they would generally agree that financial education for society, for youth is a good thing, but why do some states adopt this more readily than others, for example?
Well, that's a very, very good question. I think that at one level, you look at the curriculum, and I'll focus on the educational arena to begin with. There are, in this country, we do have a really great education system, but there are challenges. And when you think about a school system saying, we'd like to introduce a course on personal finance, that's all well and good. But on the other hand, there's research that shows that the United States is not doing a particularly good job, for example, in terms of educating its children to be proficient in math, proficient in science. And so there are competing priorities. And so in some cases, some states that we can talk about in a few minutes have really found ways to try and address both the challenges of improving the students' skills and knowledge in areas like mathematics and science, but they've also found room in the curriculum to introduce a unit or a course on personal finance and have found the resources to train the teachers. Personal finance education is relatively new in the education field, and so when you, it's not like waving a magic wand and saying, let's introduce this course. You have to develop curricula, obviously, but you have to train teachers. And so the imperative is to make sure that once a school system has decided to introduce a course on personal finance, that all of the ingredients are in place to help the educators be successful in their instruction and help the students learn as best they can around the subject matter.
And so if I jump on that, specifically the ingredients for the teachers, what are some of those key ingredients, both that might be provided at the state level, at the district level, as well as different resources that your organization might help to provide?
Well, we have a program that supports personal finance instruction in high schools, and we started this program in New York State in 2003. And the topics that are covered in any personal finance course are fairly well known, but in New York State at the time, personal finance was introduced as a unit within the economics curriculum. And so the teachers who were being asked to teach now a unit on personal finance in otherwise a macro and microeconomics course really needed significant knowledge and skills-based training to be able to teach not just macro and microeconomics, but personal finance as well. And so very early on, we and other organizations began really focusing through conferences and workshops, both on and offline, on-site and online, to build teacher capacity through content-based training about the subject matter that they hitherto had not taught. And this is a systemic need that one of your participants is from Virginia, I noticed, and this is one of the states where personal finance is a requirement for all students. A course on personal finance has to be taken by all students as a graduation requirement. And in some ways, the state of Virginia is the bellwether because there have been resources allocated across the state, district-wide, state level, school-wide, to make sure that the teachers who are teaching this required course have the requisite knowledge to be successful in the classroom.
And so obviously, having the teachers be comfortable with the content itself, especially when you think about it, right? You would assume that a math teacher, let's say, went to school and learned math, and so when they learn how to teach it, it's different, but it's not that much of a stretch because it's there already, right?
Mm-hmm.
As you mentioned, personal finance historically has not really been taught much until recent history, right? So most of the teachers teaching it have not themselves been students absorbing this information. So there's certainly an uphill battle when it comes to the content. But beyond the content, what are some other resources and key ingredients that a teacher might really value?
Well, when we created our certification program, felt that a well-trained teacher also needed instructional resources to support their lessons. And so we created a curriculum that is a roadmap of the topics that need to be taught during this course or unit on personal finance. And what's really nice about the world of personal finance is that the topics, whether you're in Kentucky or Michigan or Virginia, the required topics or the topics that need to be covered in a course on personal finance are generally the same. You need to teach the students about budgeting. You need to teach them about financial goal setting. You need to teach them about saving, retirement planning, and so on. And so we were at the forefront, I think, in creating a set of standards, if you will, that around these generic topics that teachers could use to guide their instruction. That's very important. And we leave it to them to develop their own lesson plans and use their own creativity in terms of how they want to teach budgeting, for example, how they want to teach retirement planning, because these are great educators. But at least we wanted to give them a roadmap, and that's a very important ingredient. And the second element is, and this is, I think, what sets us apart from some other program providers, is that we wanted to make sure that the schools that we work with had some measurable way of assessing the impact of the instruction. And so we created a certification exam that schools administer and teachers administer at the end of a course or unit on personal finance. And it enables the school to take a temperature of the financial literacy of the students after this course or unit. And we created a credentialing exam because, students don't like to take tests. But if they're offered the opportunity to earn some form of credential, then it's an incentive. And so our credentialing exam provides an opportunity for any student that passes this national standardized test to become certified financially literate. And they get a certificate that demonstrates that they're graduating with knowledge, skills, hopefully to lead a life of financial well-being. And although it's not a credential that is going to get them a job necessarily, because personal finance is a life skill, it's not a vocational skill, we have many, many stories of students that have used this credential on their resumes, on the college applications, in job interviews, and so on. And because it's a different and rather innovative type of credential, it stands out. And so it has helped students on their path to college and to work. So back to your question, the training is key. Having some form of curriculum that is a guide for instruction is also key, and having some measurable assessment of how effective the instruction has been are ingredients that have been the hallmark of what we're trying to do.
All right, wonderful. Before I continue with my line of questioning, I wanted to invite the audience. One, if you have any questions so far, please send it via the chat feature, and I will ask that of David. The other thing I'm also interested from you guys is what drew you to attend this webinar. Obviously, well, not obviously, right? So what drew you to this webinar? Do you have an interest in just sort of learning about the state of financial education as a whole? Were you hoping to get more specific tips that David's organization has kind of gleaned along the way? So I'd love to hear your input as to what drew you to this webinar and what you're hoping to get out of it, so that whether with your specific question or just general topics, we could make sure that we're meeting those expectations. So I'll just pause here for a second to see if we get any chats along those lines. I'll continue to monitor the chat. Funny, I always struggle. I used to be in radio, and we always had no dead silence, no silence on the radio. But of course, you want to give people a chance to think here. Okay, so thank you for chiming in. One person shared. Curious to see what David had to say, and looking for tips. So we'll definitely be covering that as we move along here. So here's a question thrown to you, David. So someone asked here, finding out advice on the quickest route to find answers to generic or relatively specific financial questions. So in other words, let's say one of the teachers or schools or whoever that you work with has, obviously at WISE, you guys aren't necessarily the ones that are directly answering those questions, but you certainly have a strength in pointing them in the right direction, right? So can you speak to, if someone wanted to find answers to these financial questions, where might they go?
Well, this is a very, very good question, because one of the outgrowths of this movement, let's call it, to help people become more financially literate has been an explosion in the number and availability of resources around personal finance. And again, going back to prior to the financial crisis, there were just not that many tools that, you know, you could Google and say, you know, I have a question about savings or something like that. There just weren't that many resources. And since then, there has been an explosion in terms of the number and type of resources. You can, and most recently, I suppose, there are now a series of apps that you can download and use to answer questions about personal finance. So there is now no shortage of places to go in order to address specific questions. Historically, I would say probably one of the pioneers of personal finance education and financial literacy is a nonprofit organization called Jumpstart. They're headquartered in Washington, D.C. We're a national partner of Jumpstart. We're you know, very supportive of their work in terms of advocating for financial education, specifically at the K-12 level, but it's not uniquely at the K-12 level. And Jumpstart has, I believe the website is www.jumpstart.org, and the S is a $. But they have a clearinghouse.
I'll send the link to their website.
But there's a clearinghouse there that is an online library of a lot of the resources that you know, your viewers and listeners might be interested in exploring. We ourselves also have a resources directory that if you have any educators you know, listening in today, that when a school signs up for our program, they get a resources directory that contains links to over 300 websites organized by topic. There's a section on the apps, there's a section on games, there's a section on lesson plans, and there are websites there where you can go in and you know, inquiry response type of thing, where you have a question and you need it answered. And the good news is that there's a lot of choice. You know, some would argue there might be too much choice now because there's so many of these resources. It's difficult to know exactly, you know, which ones are the best. But there is a lot of choice. And the other thing about it is that most of these resources are free, either available through nonprofits who have been able to create the resources from grant funding. You know, we're largely grant funded as a nonprofit. But or from other sources that you know, have used their own resources to create information that they think is useful to the public. Firms in the financial sector, for example, have created tools and resources and other things to help not just clients of the bank or insurance company or whatever, but have created tools that are publicly available through their websites that are very helpful indeed. So there's an awful lot out there that is very, very helpful.
One of the questions that was posed, have you come across any specific apps that your partners, your teachers have had success utilizing with your students or in general?
Well, the apps actually have been more tailored towards the adult population. So there's, I I forget the name of it, but I could certainly share it with you, and you could in turn share it with your listeners and viewers. But there's one very good one that was recently produced, and it's a way of online. It's sort of auto budgeting, and so through the app you can link it to your checking account, and you can set up through this link. The app knows what's coming into your checking account, and it knows what you're spending, and you can create a rule that says if I spend, let's say, less than 80% of what I earn, then take that 20% surplus and send it off and put it into a savings account. And then, let's say in another week, you spend more than you earn, then obviously you can't save, but it keeps track on a dynamic way of how you're spending relative to what you're earning, and through rules, you can basically when the user has surplus income or leftover income, can have the money put into a savings account. So these are more applications for the wider community as opposed to specific students.
And so when David does get that, because there's a few similar apps that are out there. I know Acorn is one that I.
Acorn is one, yes. I think that's the name.
That's the one? Okay. So I'll send that out to people in a second. To your point with regards to youth apps, part of the challenge is just kind of designing around something that is not just pretty to use and looks good, but actually changes behavior. And I was actually reading about an app that was being developed by in conjunction with a design company, and I don't know whether or not it's been fully developed yet. It might still be in pilot mode. But basically, the way that it had worked was where it was kind of like a peer-to-peer thing. If you think of some of the apps that are most popular among teenagers and such, you look at Instagram is obviously very popular. Snapchat is probably one of the more popular ones now. And so it kind of, what they were experimenting with is taking advantage of the social aspect that's built into those apps and have it with regards to finance, where you might have a student that was about to make a decision and to basically put it out there to their peers to get validation that it's a good idea, a bad idea, that kind of stuff. And so I really think we're going to see a lot more interesting things in the coming years in this space. But it's not that David and I are withholding some. It's just there's just simply not a lot of good apps that have been proven to move the needle when it comes to this stuff.
But you're also raising a very interesting point, Chris, and that is that the impact on behavior is the holy grail of personal finance education. And again, from the early days, I would say the primary focus was on building knowledge, building skills around managing your money. But the key is not, do you know that an APR stands for annual percentage rate? It's, you have two credit cards. One has a higher APR than the other. That should trigger some action in terms of keeping one and not keeping the other. And so the dialogue in financial education really has expanded beyond the idea that just being knowledgeable makes you financially literate to one in which it's how financial education could be apps, could be classroom instruction, could be a workshop. However the education is delivered or however the instruction is delivered is how is that affecting the person's financial habits? And is it affecting the person's financial habits? And we, for example, do measure the effect of instruction on students' financial behaviors as a consequence of taking a course on personal finance. And our data is very positive. It shows that schools that are teaching personal finance are, in fact, moving the needle in terms of their students' financial habits, whether it's, whether they've started to budget, whether they've opened a bank account, whether they've started to save, whether they're starting to set financial goals, whether they're comparison shopping, things like that. And these really are, this is the key, because it's like riding a bike. Once you learn how to ride your bike, it's in your DNA. Once you've learned how to be financially savvy and make sound financial decisions, there are bumps in the road inevitably, but it hopefully becomes part of your DNA, and so your money management behavior or sound money management behavior stays with you throughout your life.
And that actually brings up another point, which is, what are things that a parent or anyone that's mentoring a young adult, a teenager, a younger child, what kind of things should they know about personal finance? How might they discuss it with their kids? Because I think that topic can get intimidating when you just focus on the knowledge, right? Because, again, the parent might say, I never learned this stuff in school. I certainly never learned it at home. Who am I to actually be able to, I don't want to teach it wrong to my kids. But the behavior definitely can be something. I mean, we all know how important it is, that, as far as learning habits from where we grow up and that sort of thing. And so where might a parent start in that journey?
Well, I think it's again, you go back to the example of the riding the bike or learning how to swim or learning a foreign language. I mean, the earlier you start, the earlier you become intuitive about these things, it becomes part of your DNA. And so, there was a point several years ago where the idea was that whether it's taught in school or whether it's learned at home, a good time to teach kids about smart money habits and so on was at the high school level, at the high school age, when they're about to leave home to go to college or to take a job or whatever the next step after high school is, that they would, at that jumping off point towards becoming independent as adults, but also independent financially, and so the right time to have this conversation was in the late teens. But more and more, I now think there's a recognition that the earlier you start as a parent or as an educator in helping people learn smart money management habits, the better. And you start with a very basic notion with a young child that says, you can't have everything you want because money is scarce. I mean, that we know that as adults. A 3- or 4-year-old doesn't necessarily, and so that concept leads into the whole discussion about needs and wants, which is at the heart of smart money management, and what are needs, what are wants, and in today's world there are some needs that are also wants, and there are some wants that are also needs, and so it sounds like it's an easy discussion, and it's very one of us you could say, well, sneakers are needs, but Air Jordans at $200 are wants, and that kind of conversation I think is very important to have with kids at a very, very early age, so that they can really differentiate between what they really need and to survive and what are wants, and then for the next step, it's like, well, I have these wants. How am I going to get them? And you get into this conversation about, well, if I have a piggy bank and there's money being set in store in my piggy bank, then when I have a want, I'll have set something aside for it. And then you introduce the concept of saving, not just for wants, but also for things that arise unexpectedly. And so you get into this notion of, well, an emergency fund and so on. And then building from that, you talk about, well, maybe the piggy bank isn't so great because it doesn't pay interest. And so you get into a conversation about opening a banking account or opening a savings account that can start to help your money to grow. And I think you start at this very elementary level of the scarcity of money and helping your children know that, and you can see how it builds into a conversation about saving and building wealth over time through savings and so on.
How do you feel, as a parent, let's say, as they're diving into this, is it enough to just talk about these things in theory as we're talking about wants and needs and so forth, or how much is appropriate for a parent to share in their own financial decisions that they make? Because, of course, money historically in our society is such a taboo topic, and there's this balance between, like, you can imagine just having a completely forthright conversation with a 5-year-old about, mommy or daddy has no money, or we're going into bankruptcy or whatever, and the stress that might cause. But then again, kids are often smarter than we give them credit for. So how might someone strike that balance between what to share and whatnot?
Well, I think that's a difficult question for me to answer because it does obviously depend situationally on each family. You are right that as a general matter, families don't discuss money around the dinner table or generally at all. And so, one of the things that I think is quite interesting from our work is that as young people are learning about personal finance in school, they're bringing that conversation into the home. And there may be conversations before, classroom instruction and so on about money. But when a student learns about, what it means to refinance a mortgage and takes that knowledge, what they've learned in the classroom, and shares it back in the home, then our data shows that can actually generate, it can facilitate the conversation, which is a really positive thing.
Yeah, I think, and we were talking earlier, didn't you share with me there was like a specific example where a student had learned something, I think it was on refinancing, where that actually...
It was a refi, and it's a really amazing story that one of the teachers in our network shared with us, and he had a student that had learned, about mortgage lending in their personal finance course, learned about what a refi is, knew that the family had a mortgage, went home, did some research around, found out what mortgage, product, I suppose, the family had, did some research around other possible products, and, found a refi opportunity that seemed to be better than the mortgage that the family had, and so took that to the parents, and it according to the teacher, they applied for a refi, and so that's just a very heartening case of how, through a combination of conversations at home as well as the instruction that's taking place at school, that the learning goes both ways. It's from adult to child and child to adult.
Yeah, that's really exciting to think about the implications of that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, earlier we were talking about how there's certainly been an increase in statewide requirements when it comes to that. So let's just start with where are we coming from? What are some of the stats around state requirements?
Well, you have, I think, if I recall, someone on from Tennessee and Virginia, and these are two of the pioneering states, of which there were four. There was Utah, Missouri, Tennessee, and Virginia were the first four states in the country to stand out and say, we are going to require our students to take a standalone semester-long course on personal finance. And that was maybe 2008. From there, we now have 17 states that essentially require students to take a course or unit on personal finance as a graduation requirement. And so in the space of 8 or 9 years, we've really come a long way in terms of school systems and what's, state ed departments really focusing on this issue and saying we need to have this as a required course for graduation. And there are other states that are in conversations about doing similar things. So, I mean, clearly there's still a long way to go because there's 50 states in the nation, but I think it's a very positive thing that from this initial four, there's a groundswell, and with these 17, I'm sure it'll build from there. It's also true that even in the states that don't have a statewide requirement for a course to be taught on personal finance, school districts on their own are taking the initiative, oftentimes with impetus coming from the community. It's not always necessarily a Board of Ed driven thing. It could be a community driven effort. And we know of a number of districts in our network that have taken the step independent of the state ed requirement or lack of a state ed requirement to have their students take a course on personal finance for graduation. So I think the momentum is there. And one of the things that is, I think, propelling this momentum is that the OECD, they've done it twice now, has measured the financial literacy of high school students across the OECD countries, and not all of them, but they took the temperature, the financial literacy temperature of students in, I think it was 18 countries in 2012, and they did it again in 2015. And among the countries, the United States was a participant. And we ranked flat in the middle. And so I think that, too, was something of a wake-up call because it helped educators around this country say, we're doing okay because we're in the middle, but this is a country that's built on excellence in education, and so we need to do better. And so I think this is helping the dialogue and the conversation around putting in place more mandates that will require students to take some form of personal finance instruction before they graduate.
And you were speaking to this a little bit to explain that it doesn't have to come from a state mandate, doesn't even have to come from a district mandate. But if someone is interested in organizing in their community some sort of momentum, where are different places that they could start?
Well, there are different avenues. If the interest is to have the school system introduce some form of formal financial education, then depending on where it is, and obviously this is not so easy to do. And I see one of your viewers is from Detroit, so you can't just walk into the Board of Ed in Detroit and say let's do it, but through parent associations, through the school board, and so on, there are channels to try and influence the discussion around the need. And I think, our conversations with schools, we're finding that there are more of these discussions taking place where there's a widespread recognition that this is a very, very important issue. The lack of financial literacy in the big picture is potentially an impediment to our long-term growth. And I think there's this emerging recognition of this holistic challenge, and therefore, growing impetus to try and make a difference, and a groundswell of effort at school level to whether it's at the elementary, middle, or high school level, to have some form of formal financial education introduced into the syllabus.
And, one of the things that you would mention is where there's been success in requiring financial education, it tends to be a requirement as a standalone course. Mm-hmm. In my understanding, whether or not it's required or not, some places will do it as a standalone course, others will have it integrated into many different courses. Mm-hmm. What have been your observations in the field as to the pros and cons of each, and what might make more sense depending?
Well, there's three models, so to speak. I mean, maybe there's more than three, but of the various possibilities, one is a standalone course. One is a comprehensive unit within a course. And then the third is what you're describing, is that personal finance instruction is integrated throughout many courses. And in our experience, the one of the first two is generally preferable to the third. We work with a lot of schools around the country where the course or our program supports a standalone course or a comprehensive unit. We work with very, very few schools where, and there aren't so many schools to my knowledge, and I could be wrong about this, but there aren't so many schools that will take personal finance and pepper it across the curriculum. There are some where they'll say, we'll start at 9th grade, let's say, and it'll be, there'll be some personal finance instruction in, civics class, and then in the math class, and so on. It's not so easy to measure the knowledge when you have the instruction, straddled across several courses. But equally, it's as long as the amount of instruction is sufficient when it's part of a unit within a course as opposed to a standalone course, either one of those is fine.
Yeah, so if I'm hearing you, it's with regards to integrating it amongst a lot of different courses, the biggest challenges are measuring the effectiveness of it. Mm-hmm. So not to say that it is or isn't effective, but it's harder to measure that.
Correct.
I would imagine capacity building would be a challenge just because now suddenly you're tasking a number of different teachers to pick this up. And so
yes.
It'll be interesting to see how this evolves, as that capacity improves. But at least in the current state, it seems like.
You're right. At one point, the President's Advisory Council, had a very interesting approach to this, and they said, well, financial literacy is two words: financial and literacy. Financial sits with math, literacy sits with language arts. And there was a discussion, this was several years ago when the council was relatively new. But there was conversation about whether the teaching of personal finance might sit better within the math strand of learning or the language arts strand of learning. And it could evolve in that way over time. Time will tell.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that strikes me is if it is going to be integrated to different things, unless someone is there to connect the dots, because I know in my other world, I'm a math tutor, right? And so I know firsthand how math does have a lot of real-world applications, of course, mm-hmm. but especially for students in high school, it's not always so obvious. And so the more of a theoretical, and that's how we tie back to finance. When finance that we've learned is more theoretical, right? So teaching a 12th grader about the college application process and how that's going to affect their finances, usually they eat that information up. They're asking tons of questions. We could try to teach the same curriculum to 9th graders. Actually, as you know, David, I taught that to 9th graders at a high school that Wise partners with, and we got there, but it's definitely a different challenge because it's not as relevant to a 9th grader. 4 years away seems like an eternity to them sometimes. So.
Yes, and I would argue also that if you're looking just at the high school level, again, our data shows that in a significant percentage of the high schools that we work with, that the course, or whether it's a course or a unit, is taught in 11th or 12th grade. It's not exclusively that at all, but that it slots more easily into the 11th and 12th grade curriculum than it does, for example, in the 9th, where we have situations of a school teaching personal finance at 9th grade. It's not always the case, but in a number of instances, the course will be a year-long course as opposed to a semester-long course, so that the students, to your point, it's earlier on in their high school education, and so there needs to be, because some of these concepts are quite difficult, they need more time to absorb the subject matter. A very good example is investing. Investing is not an easy topic to teach, particularly when you're thinking about, well, what is a bond? And that's difficult for a lot of people to grasp. Well, how does a bond price? And so that's a challenge for a 9th grader.
And as it is for adults as well, right? Mm-hmm. So really, keeping in mind relevancy, and that just ties into what we talked about earlier with as a parent talks to a child, making it relevant to them is probably the single biggest thing, perhaps.
Yep. Yes.
I'd like to open it up to any general questions that anyone has for David or myself around this topic, so please chat in any questions that you have. You see on the slide more information if anyone does have a school or whatever the case is that they might want to reach out to Wise. Feel free to reach out to the email address that's provided there. I'll also remind you, so as you guys know, we do these webinars twice a month. In 2 weeks on June 20th, I'm going to be having another conversation with an outside expert. This time we're going to be bringing in Tracy Becker from North Shore Advisory to talk about business credit. And so those of you that have followed GreenPath for a while know that from time to time we've done webinars on credit reports, credit scores, and of course we've always done them with regards to your personal credit report and score. But many of you may not be aware that if you're a small business, there's actually different credit bureaus and different credit scores associated with your business. And so we'll be going over the ins and outs of what you need to know. So if you know anyone with a small business, if you are a small business, if you help people that are small businesses, feel free to go to our website to sign up for that. And again, it'll be a similar format as David and I are doing here today. Before we look at any questions that have been posed, if anyone is interested in reaching out to us, you see our phone number and website there, so we're more than happy to talk to you or those people that you might serve. Take a look if we have any additional questions. Okay. So while we're waiting for any other questions to pop in, I'll throw out one more question to you, David. If you had a crystal ball and we were going to go into the future, however long you want, 5 years, 20 years, whatever, where do you see things evolving in the financial education space? I'll just keep that general.
I think the financial education train has left the station and will not go back. And I think there's sufficient understanding and about how critical a financially literate nation is to its long-term health and well-being that the policy initiatives, the state ed initiatives will continue to advance. And I don't know whether it's 5, 10, 15, or 20 years, but I do, our vision is that at some point down the road, a wise financial literacy program, or our financial literacy program, will be in every single high school in the country. And, it's a hugely ambitious vision, but I think it's how long it takes us to get there, who knows? But I do feel that there is real momentum around this issue for all segments of the population. It's not just youth. There's a critical need for people to be more intuitive about their personal finance, and I think there's an understanding of that critical need.
All right. Great. So we'll leave it with that thought. We'll see what the future brings, but hey, there's no thought too ambitious. GreenPath's what we call our big, hairy, audacious goal is to remix the American dream so that it works for everyone. So you're just trying to get it to every high school. We're trying to cover all 300 million.
Oh, good for you.
You can get there, then maybe we can too. So I sent each of you via chat a link to a SurveyMonkey to get your feedback on today's presentation. So if you could kindly spend a couple of minutes just to fill that out, give us feedback on both today's presentation and what you'd like to see in the future. There's some open-ended questions in there as well. We welcome any feedback that you're willing to provide. So we thank you again for joining us today over lunch for some, breakfast for others. And I hope everyone has a great day. And thank you again, David, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. It was really good.
Absolutely. Enjoy, everyone. Take care.
All right. Take care.